Methods for modelling multi-hazards in the Meteor project. First, I'd like to introduce the Meteor project, which enabled the creation of this video. Meteor stands for Modelling Exposure Through Earth Observation Routines and was funded by the UK Space Agency through their International Partnership Programme as part of the Global Challenges Research Fund. The Meteor project aims to develop innovative application of Earth observation technologies to improve understanding of exposure. Natural hazards have had escalating impacts, which are contributed to by an increasing exposure of population and assets. However, a major challenge when making disaster risk management decisions can be a poor understanding of the distribution and character of exposure. Robust quantitative methods are required to justify these decisions, and in this project we are looking at the use of Earth observation technologies within that context. Within the Meteor project, there is also the aim to share knowledge. This video is produced as a part of a series of educational videos to enable the use of Meteor products and data. In this talk on modelling multi-hazards as part of the Meteor project, I will cover the testing of existing multi-hazard models, such as the Grieving and CAPS models, the use of expert elicitation and weighting, the protocols for modelling the Meteor data and some initial model outputs, and outline the sensitivity testing that is still ongoing. In the previous presentations, we have seen how the single hazard footprints and exposure data has been created for the Meteor project. In this presentation, I will be describing how we have taken these separate hazard and exposure inputs and created a model that can aggregate them to give us a national multi-hazard map. In Nepal, the single hazards addressed in the Meteor project were landslide, seismic, and flood. In the previous presentations, we have seen how the single hazard footprints and exposure data has been created for the Meteor project. In this presentation, I will be describing how we have taken these separate hazard and exposure inputs and created a model that can aggregate them to give us a national multi-hazard map. In the introduction to multi-hazard slides, we looked at how each single hazard exhibits its own characteristics, such as time of onset, duration, and extent. And because of this, the fact that multi-hazard assessments have to be able to address hazards that may be related to each other, potentially generating hazard cascades, hazards that have different impacts on buildings or infrastructure, and the fact that they have different hazard characteristics and therefore different methods of observation and monitoring. It is important, therefore, that any of the existing methods of hazard quantification need to be adapted to allow for the comparison of multiple hazards. To explore the best ways to combine the data created by the Meteor project and to develop robust models for analysing multi-hazards with exposure, we have reviewed a collection of different models that have been designed to address multi-hazards. Some of these models focus on the frequency of events and use of historical dollar losses as a proxy for infrastructure impact or exposure, whilst others are concerned with producing more qualitative results. For some of the hazards considered in the Meteor project, it may be possible to retrieve information that would satisfy a quantitative model. For example, the earthquake epicenters would give us the origin of an event. Or, if we were looking at severity descriptors, we might be able to get information on maximum flood heights. For other hazards in the study, however, the incomplete historic records make it difficult to estimate key factors such as historic frequency, probability of occurrence, or losses. This meant that developing a purely quantitative model for Meteor that allows for the determination of absolute values was not possible. Instead, a semi-quantitative model, including the development of indicators, helps to limit the effect of different types of data. As we discussed in the Introduction to Multi-Hazards talk, indices offer a continuous standardization of differing and therefore not directly comparable parameters, and so can be applied to the data collected in this project and allow for its integration. After reviewing the existing models, two differing methodologies that were deemed most compatible with the data generated by the Meteor project were selected for testing. The first, proposed by Grieving et al., is designed to be a regional assessment, and the second, by Capps et al., a more local town catchment scale assessment. For the purposes of this methodology testing and development, we used the draft hazard and exposure data for Tanzania because they were more complete than the Nepal data at the time of this analysis. Grieving et al. Developed an integrated risk assessment for multi-hazards method in which the issue of main concern is risk, which is defined as the product of hazard and vulnerability. Vulnerability in this assessment is defined as the degree of fragility of a system or community towards natural and technological hazards, and is therefore place-specific, integrating hazard, exposure, and the coping capacity of different regions. They consider three types of hazard exposure. First, economic, any factors that can affect the economy of a region that can be damaged by an extreme event. Second, social, assesses any factor that might make people more vulnerable, for example, their age or education. Third, ecological, assesses ecosystems and their environmental fragility. This spatial risk assessment framework originally considers multi-hazards as hazards with spatial relevance, for example, river flooding and volcanic eruptions, but not hazards such as meteorite impacts or collective risks that have the potential to threaten the entire community. The method consists of four key components. These are the generation of hazard maps. The aim of these maps is to display the location and intensity of spatially relevant hazards. Where possible, this intensity should be representative of the hazard's frequency and magnitude. As it is not possible to classify all hazards on the same scale, these maps are classified using an ordinal scale, using 5 related hazard classes. This generates an index for each hazard, which means that they are compared and combined, whilst mitigating the effects of different types of data and varying levels of uncertainty. The figure on the right of the screen represents the indices developed for the relevant hazards in Tanzania. The second stage of this model is the production of an integrated hazard map. All hazard data are compiled into one map showing overall hazard potential. This aggregation is straightforward as all of the maps display the hazard potential as a 1 to 5 index. It is possible, however, that some hazards are considered as more important than others. In this case, it is possible to weight the hazard contributions to the final aggregation. Grieving suggests using the Delphi method of expert elicitation to define these weights. In this meteor example, the hazard potential is assigned, weighted, and aggregated at the pixel scale. The next stage of this model is the creation of a vulnerability map. Any available information concerning social and economic vulnerability is combined to create a map showing the overall vulnerability of each region. In this model, the exposure of infrastructure, buildings, and the production capacity are all defined by the regional GDP, and the human damage potential is defined by the population density. We have not assessed the possible impacts on the ecosystem in Meteor, as this is not within the scope of this project. The final stage of this model is to compile an integrated risk map. The hazard and vulnerability maps are integrated to produce a map that shows the integrated risk each region is exposed to. This allows for the user to differentiate between areas that are simply hazardous and those areas that are risky due to a higher degree of inherent vulnerability. This method was chosen as a test methodology for the Meteor project because it can be applied at any geographical scale and for any hazard, and because it is fundamentally concerned with multi-hazards. The method designed by Capps et al. Is an indicator-based vulnerability method that builds on the Papathoma tsunami vulnerability assessment and adapts it for a multi-hazard context. It is a GIS-based method that assesses hazard-specific physical vulnerability by selecting element characteristics that may be indicative of vulnerability. Vulnerability is considered as physical vulnerability of buildings. It does not take into account socioeconomic indicators of vulnerability. This methodology was developed to be used at local or regional scales, coupled with field studies of building damage data, which may limit its applicability to national surveys. This method was chosen as the second test methodology for the Meteor project because of its capacity to develop relative hazard vulnerability in a semi-quantitative manner at a variety of scale. A simplified workflow of the model can be seen here. The first step is to identify the relevant hazards for the study area and develop the relative hazard information. In this case, the hazards defined by the Meteor project. The second step is the identification of factors that affect the vulnerability of buildings. This figure shows how indicators can be organised and weighted to create a relative vulnerability index. In Meteor, the factors that have been assessed are controlled by the input exposure data that was produced by ImageCat. The factors that are available and comparable across the hazards included in the Meteor project are the building materials and the number of floors in each building. These vulnerability indicators selected need to be considered for each hazard individually. In the methodology defined by CAPS, the surroundings of the building are included in the assessment. For example, the role of land cover and neighbouring buildings. As the Meteor project is producing relative vulnerability on a national scale, it has not been possible to include this component of the analysis. For each indicator, a weight is defined that reflects the relationship between the indicator and the hazard. This is an example of how the hazards from the Meteor project were included in this matrix. In this study, these weights were defined using a combination of fragility curves, when available, published literature, and expert elicitation within the Meteor consortium. Once these weights are defined, the CAPS method applies a weighted linear combination technique. This produces a relative vulnerability index that is not dependent on the hazard intensity, but instead reflects the relative vulnerability for each building for different hazards. The final stages of the CAPS method makes an assessment to understand the interrelationships between the hazards in this study by means of creating a hazard matrix. The hazard matrix shown here is an example of a matrix that could be constructed for the Meteor project in Nepal. The user can read the matrix either left to right or right to left, starting at the blue boxes in the centre, depending on which hazard interactions they want to consider. The red box shows the impact of a landslide on increasing the flood potential of a region, for example, by reading the matrix left to right. The yellow box highlights the possible effect an earthquake could have on making a building more vulnerable to landslides by reading the matrix from right to left. To produce an integrated hazard matrix, including all relevant outputs, there must be an understanding of how hazard and vulnerability indicators interact with each other and what their relative weights are in the subsequent index. A summation of indicator scores per pixel would allow for a straightforward analysis, but it seems a more appropriate method would allow for these different components to be weighted differently, reflecting their relative severities or their frequencies relative to each other. These weights can be determined either using expert elicitation or statistically by weighted linear combination models, or a combination of both. Both of the methods tested in this analysis require some component of expert elicitation. This allows for the users to define the rankings of hazards relative to each other and therefore their subsequent weighting in the resulting index. Where possible, these have been underpinned by tools such as fragility curves and inventories of data. However, not all of the hazards considered in this analysis have complete historic inventories, making constructing frequency magnitude distributions complicated. Expert elicitation allows for users to draw on experience from other locations and make a best estimate of the likely relationships between hazards and vulnerability indicators. The weights defined in this table have been solicited from experts in the Meteor consortium and were used in testing both methodologies. The results of the grieving model show that the highest risk areas identified in the methodology are not linked with particularly high hazard for any of the hazards that were addressed in the Meteor project. Instead, the outcome highlights the regions associated with the highest regional GDP per capita in the country. As the grieving method produces a regional output, it is not possible to disaggregate which parts of these regions are driving the higher risk scores. The CAPS methodology, in contrast, produces a separate output for each hazard at compatible scales. Here is an example of the relative vulnerability map for seismic hazard. On the left side of the image is the simplified earthquake hazards map, and on the right there are inserts for regions around both Dodoma and Dar es Salaam, showing the relative earthquake vulnerability index. The highest earthquake hazard areas in this analysis highlight the East African Rift Valley. This means that Dar es Salaam is categorized as low risk, but areas of Dodoma, where the capital has moved to, is medium to high risk. When we assess the vulnerability of buildings in Dar es Salaam to seismic hazard, it appears that areas on the edges of the city have higher vulnerability. Similarly, in Dodoma, buildings on the periphery of the main urban areas have higher vulnerability. On reviewing building information in this location, it appears that these regions have a higher proportion of traditional, unreinforced and wooden buildings than some of the areas closer to the city centre. It therefore follows that this analysis is correctly identifying areas where property is less likely to have been designed or retrofitted to withstand earthquakes. In this test study, we used two different methodologies to assess multi-hazards and exposure in Tanzania. Whilst the grieving method allows us to assess the national scale integrated risk, the finest resolution of the final product is only regional. The CAPS methodology provides the ability to retain the 90-metre resolution of the original data, and therefore produces greater detail for assessing exposure. This method, however, generates unique outputs for each hazard, and it is therefore not possible to assess the integrated multi-hazard risk. We therefore developed a model in the Meteor project that is a hybrid of the two presented here. The initial step in this new Meteor model is very similar to the CAPS method, as it produces a relative hazard vulnerability map. For the purposes of this example, the steps necessary to produce a relative flood vulnerability map are shown here. This process, however, is broadly the same for each hazard. Firstly, each data point from the hazard assessment is normalised and then converted to a classified flood value. After this, the flood value per pixel is multiplied by the sum of the weighted percentage of each building type in that pixel as a function of the total number of buildings per pixel. If there is more than one output for a specific hazard, for example, in this case, we have outputs for fluvial and pluvial flooding, these outputs are then weighted either through expert elicitation or, if possible, to reflect a frequency analysis of the hazard events and are weighted either through expert elicitation or to reflect the frequency of hazard events and combine to produce a relative vulnerability map for that hazard. Once the individual hazard vulnerability maps for each hazard have been produced, they can be weighted independently, combined and normalised to create a national scale multi-hazard map like this weighted multi-hazard map for Nepal. These first results from the Meteor multi-hazard model highlight differences between Kathmandu and the rest of the country, the reasons for which need to be investigated further. In creating this model, we aim to develop a pragmatic approach to integrate datasets that differ widely from each other. However, combining data that has been generated by different processes incorporates uncertainty into the model. We intend to review these final model outputs as well as the relative vulnerability index as part of the final deliverables of the Meteor project, where we will also perform sensitivity analysis to explore the effect of varying weighting factors on overall results. The primary aims of our sensitivity analysis is to examine the effects of varying model parameters on the final outputs of the model. By varying one modeled parameter at a time in a systematic way, we are able to observe how a small change in a parameter can generate a larger change on the model outputs by looking at the residuals between the two final products. Assessing the difference in these outputs will allow us to infer the robustness of the current Meteor model and identify the inputs that have the greatest control on the final outputs. These may be the weights assigned to the exposure data, or the threshold values that were assigned when creating the index for the hazard assessment data, for example. The red boxes on this diagram highlight the component of the model where these analyses will focus. As I have explained, the weights applied to the different exposure categories were derived through a combination of expert elicitation, harvesting from existing literature, and reviewing available vulnerability curves like the one pictured here. They therefore form what we propose is a best estimate of the weights that should be attached to different building criteria and different types of hazard. We aim to validate these weights by comparing them to selected vulnerability curves that can be compared to the specific hazard value at the pixel scale. This will be an extremely computationally expensive process, and so initially we will perform this analysis over a small subsection of the national scale data. We also plan to assess the impact of varying the hazard assessments and their subsequent weights. To do this, we will explore the differences in outputs when the 1 in 10 year and the 1 in 1,000 year flood hazard data are included, instead of the 1 in 100 year return period. This will provide a sense of what the difference between a worst case and best case outputs are. When this analysis is complete, we will provide updated training material to include these final outputs and findings. This talk gives an outline of the production of the modelling protocols developed for the Meteor project. Guided by existing literature, we have tested two differing approaches and used these as a basis to develop a model that is aligned with the goals of the Meteor project. We hope to share more information with you about the testing of this model in the coming months. This is the end of this talk on modelling multi-hazards in the Meteor project. Further information on some of the models reviewed as part of this process can be found in these key references. There are also 2 milestone reports available from the Meteor project that covers this work in detail. They are M6.2, Methods for Analysing Multi-Hazards with Exposure, and M6.3, Meteor, Draft Protocols on Hazard and Exposure Modelling. Thank you.